Okay, just a note that the live stream to YouTube is not working. It says I have internal error 505. So we will record this and just upload it immediately afterwards. So welcome to people who are attending. We'll just wait a few more minutes for attendees to join, and then we'll get started. Yeah, it is, Jeff. I don't know if you can try it as well.
Um, the option doesn't come up for me.
Okay. Let me just see. Oh, whoops, I made the wrong person host. Sorry. Oh, Catherine, I accidentally made you host. Would you mind making Jeff the host? Apologies. And for everyone who's joined, we'll be starting in just a few moments.
How do I make Jeff the host?
Just under panelists, under participants, next to
Yes.
Jeff's name, there should be a thing that says more, and it should say make host. Apologies, click the
Jeff
wrong thing.
Bradley, there's his name. Asked to unmute. No, I don't know.
If you just, there should be a more
Make
button.
host.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to get started now and just welcome everybody who's joined. Um, my name is Alex McClelland. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University, and I'm one of the people who leads the Tracking Injustice project. Tracking Injustice is a criminal justice, our criminal legal law and transparency project. And we have been tracking police-involved deaths and deaths in custody for the past number of years. I encourage people to check out our website, trackinginjustice.ca, where today we are talking about the launch of our deaths in custody data. And we were going to hear findings from the database and also hear some experiences from family members and from some experts and advocates around the implications of this work. So I first off want to acknowledge that we've gathered here online. I myself am currently on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and I want to send much respect to everyone for the lands that you're on, and acknowledge that, and acknowledge also the ongoing colonial violence that exists in the context of prisons and jails and corrections institutions and by police, something that we are talking about today. Also wanted to note that this is very heavy work. We're talking about violence, harm, and death. And so I want to just encourage people to take breaks, take care, take a breath while you need it. Some of the findings of this research may be challenging to hear, so just want to encourage people to take the time they need to absorb them. The run of our event today, we're hoping to go for 45 minutes. We're going to start with a presentation from the Tracking and Justice project in terms of going over the findings of our research that are enclosed in our database. Also encouraging people to do their own research. All of our database is public and available for everyone to look at. And then we're going to hear from family members and some experts and advocates after that. So I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay, Jennings, and Jeff Bradley, who are going to walk us through some of the findings of the Tracking and Justice Project.
Morning. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for everybody for joining. Just bear with me for a quick minute as I share my screen. And you don't really want to see my link tree, which is fine. Sorry, guys. I am joining today from Mississauga, which is Treaty 13, and Mississauga's of the credit. And we are about to begin. So, Prisoners' Justice Day is tomorrow, and so Tracking and Justice decided to launch this publicly accessible database the day before, so that way we could start some momentum around Prisoners' Justice Day and bring it to light. So what is the Tracking and Justice? Tracking and Justice is a law enforcement and criminal legal data and transparency project tracking police-involved deaths and deaths in custody across Canada. This project aims to provide access to data and analysis so individuals, organizations, and communities can collectively advocate, shape policy, and create accountability. How we define custody within our project. We define custody as being held in a condition where the right to liberty is deprived by police during arrest or after being arrested, by corrections workers in a corrections facility, or in a care facility under a legal order due to mental health legislation. This can include police cars or police station holding cells, provincial correctional centers for remanded and sentenced individuals of 2 years less a day, federal correction centers for a sentence of 2 or more years, prisoner transportation vehicles, court holding cells, immigration detention centers, youth detention centers, and psychiatric forensic facilities. When you go look at our database, you're going to be able to look at all of this stuff. And so part of the launch is that this is the first ever publicly accessible online database on deaths in custody across Canada since the year 2000. People can explore the data to search the full name of the person who died in custody. You also have an option to hide it. You can also look at the age at the time of death, date of the death, year, gender, race, province or territory, institution or police force at which the person was held in custody, type of custody, tactical interventions used, and manner of death. What we've also made this website very accessible is that when you do your own search, if you want to get that information for your own advocacy, you can actually download selected data into a spreadsheet and access a folder with the access to information requests that we receive from government departments. Sorry, guys. Okay, and so now with this, I'm just going to go through just to show you really briefly how you can search through our website. And so everybody can see this, which is great. So this is the front page of our website. So at the top here, we had the initial project, which is the police-involved deaths using excessive force. If you scroll down a little bit, it will give you the updated numbers of the people that have died in custody. And we're at 41 in 2024. And so if you want to explore the data, you can just go into tracking deaths in custody. You can go explore data. I also don't know, sorry if I'm yelling into the Zoom. I have a lot of feelings. And so what you can do is when you want to explore the data, press start exploring. Doesn't really go down too much. It will go through our methodology, and it'll go through a bunch of, again, our definitions and everything that you can look at. And then when you get down to this part, this is where you can input the name, you can input age, gender, date, year, race, province or territory, and so manner of death, if you wanted to find out undetermined. Sorry if this is taking long. And then what will happen at the bottom is that things will come up for you. And you can either show the person's name or you cannot show the person's name. And this will be a list of all the undetermined. So check out that website so you can pull up some of your own analysis. So what does the database tell us? The database tells us that 2,131 deaths in custody across Canada since the year 2000. We also figured out that an average of 87 deaths per year in the database. Between a 10-year period from 2013 to 2023, the average number of deaths is 118 per year. You'll hear a little bit more about that from Jeff later on. We are confident to say that overall deaths in custody we have tracked seem to be on the rise. And we also struggle with the lack of consistent information on deaths in custody. Our database is using a living methodology, which means it will continue to develop and grow over time as more data becomes available. So now for the findings and analysis from the deaths in custody database. According to the data we currently have access to, there were 129 deaths in 2018, 134 deaths in 2019, 165 deaths in 2020, and 169 deaths in 2021, which is the highest number of deaths per year we have documented this far. Factors impacting this potential rise are a challenge to disentangle with the limited information available, but could include COVID-19, along with increased use of remand and higher incarceration rates. Due to the lack of access to information, the number of deaths prior to 2010 currently in the database is limited. Government data portals are inconsistent, with some including information only as far back as 2007 or 2005. Depending on the jurisdiction for deaths that occurred prior to 2010, we have found that record keeping is lacking, making access to information requests challenging or with limited detail. However, we recently received an access to information request from Correctional Service Canada, which may fill some gaps, and our team will be adding the details in the database over the next few months. And when we received that information request, it wasn't just a couple hundred people that we got. We had another information request of thousands of people that we're not sure we have in our database or are duplicates. So we will be letting that information out in the near future. Additionally, data for 2022 and 2024 is also not consistent and is limited in detail due to the inability to access information because of ongoing internal investigations, the backlog of deaths of coroner's inquests to be completed. It can take years after the death before the results are made available to the public, and provincial and territorial and federal government agencies are not continually tracking deaths in custody. This means there are more deaths that we have not yet collected. This slide here shows the average age of death for those in the database. It's very sad to say that the average age of death for those in custody that are dying in custody is 44.2 years old. If we compare that to Statistics Canada information, life expectancy as of 2022 in Canada was 81 years old. So if you have experience of incarceration, that takes away at least half your life. It's also really important to note that the youngest person in our database is 14 years old, and the oldest person is 90 years old, both whose cause of death was due to suicide. I'm now going to send it over to Jeff to continue on with our findings.
Right, thanks, Lindsay. Do you mind just, sorry, sharing the slides just because it's I don't know, my screen is weird.
Of course, you want me to go back into that. 1 second.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the identified gender of the deaths in custody in our database. So accurate information on incarcerated people's gender identity is hard to come by. Our project does not assign gender based on the type of institution someone is incarcerated within, meaning if someone dies in an institution designated for women, we do not automatically assume that the person identified as a woman. We will indicate gender as known based on the use of pronouns in coroner's documents, other official documents, or credible sources related to a death. There are 1,479 deceased people who are identified as men in official documents we examined, which accounted for 69.4% of deaths in the database. There are 129 people who are identified as women in official documents, which accounted for 6% of deaths in the database. There was also one two-spirited person. In 522 of the cases, or 24.5% of cases, gender is actually unknown, as there is often not enough information to make that determination. There is also one trans man and one trans woman who are included by gender. They're included in this by the gender that they identify with. Just to give a brief race breakdown, so most of the data on racialization is actually unknown, unfortunately. So of the people who died in custody, the identified race for 84% of the deceased of the persons in our database are actually unknown. The many unknowns are due to a lack of demographic information being recorded or released to the public about people's racial identity and backgrounds. For those deaths that we have information on, 6.8% were identified as white, 7.8% were identified as Indigenous, and 1.3% were identified as Black. There was also some others that were of other racial backgrounds, but they're not included on this chart just because the amount is so little. So looking at the manner of death, so a manner of death is actually determined by coroners after an inquest has happened when someone dies. So the manner of death will determine whether an inquest must happen or if the families have to request an inquest to happen. So these are the 5 categorizations that the chief coroner classifies people within. And what we found is that there's 459 deaths that are actually unknown. There's 365 that are accidental. There was 102 homicides. There was 615 natural deaths, 452 suicides, and 135 that were undetermined. So I just read like the actual raw numbers, and if you look in this graph, it shows the percentages, but I really wanted to say the amount since these are human lives. So yeah, so sometimes we go back and forth between percentage, but for this one, I just wanted to say exactly how many people that included. So this next chart basically combines deaths in custody in the database, breaking it down by deaths that are natural, unnatural, and undetermined. So if you look at this chart, this pie graph, sorry, 54.7% of the deaths in the database are actually of unnatural causes. So things like suicide, homicide, and accidental. 37% are natural, and 8.3 were undetermined. Now breaking it down, so the 5 categories that the coroner classifies deaths in actually lack a bit of detail, which means we do not get a fulsome picture of the patterns of death. This is why Tracking Injustice analyzes the deaths to determine and break down their causes to gain a better understanding of how people are actually dying in custody. So we found that 26 people died of asphyxia. Sorry, I don't know why my numbers here are a little bit off. 270 of chronic illness or condition. There was 241 hangings. There was 167 injuries or traumas. There was 145 medical events, 299 overdoses, and 950 were unknown. So yeah, looking at this chart, you can see a big piece of it obviously is unknown, but the others speak for themselves. This chart, I won't go into too much detail, but basically it breaks down the deaths in custody by province and territory. And you can see there, for instance, like Ontario has, 731 deaths, and like BC has 600 or 268. So yeah, we're going to be doing more analysis on this to actually compare the population of incarcerated people versus those that die. So we're likely to believe that this also coincides with how many people are actually incarcerated in those provinces and territories and the level of deaths that are happening. We then break down the deaths by jurisdiction. So this here shows you that 13.1% of deaths were in police custody, 35.1% were in federal custody. And then there was 24.9% in provincial and territorial custody, 23.2% were unknown, and others included in that 3.6% would be things like someone who died in a mental health institution, but were under a, may have been transferred out of a provincial facility, are on an immigration hold, are in youth detention, or in a healing lodge. So in 62.9% of our cases, it is actually unknown whether a tactical intervention was involved in a death. So this chart breaks that down. In about 31% of our cases, no tactical intervention was used. In about 6%, so that's 128 deaths of our cases, involved the use of tactical interventions. It is important to note that these numbers will change as we uncover and get access to more information, including when coroner's inquest happens. So a lot of this information is not always made available public. So yes, the tactical interventions make up a small portion of the deaths in custody, but that does not necessarily mean that they weren't involved in some of the deaths. We just don't know yet. I also wanted to mention that 15% of the deaths involved tactical interventions that were actually deemed natural. So just to break it down a bit more on like what those tactical interventions included that were involved in the death. So of 128 deaths involved a tactical intervention, there was a number of important types. It's important to note that physical handling and restraint equipment are the highest. This is due to things like handcuffs being used as restraint and a part of the arrest process, transferring someone in custody policies, and used in correctional facilities or transportation vehicles. This graph shows that more often than not, there's a combination of tactical interventions. So it's not always just one thing that's actually being used. It can be a combination of sorts. And yeah, I don't think I'll go into some of the others, but you can see from this graph too that there's a high percentage of a combination being used in 23.8% of them. Lastly, this is so this graph shows the increase around transparency and a lack of access or public information being reported around deaths in custody. So everything is actually kept internal, or you have to pay to get through freedom of information requests to actually get this information, unless and in many cases, obviously, it's redacted, right? And governments will cite privacy issues. Yet when someone dies inside custody, the press releases are quick to include the charges or the criminal history and sentences that people that have died are, but they won't include any other information. So just something to note. You can see in this graph that it's gone up, where we actually know less information over time. So where did this data come from? We filed over 21 access to information requests. So this is legislation within federal, provincial, and territorial governments where you can request this information. Of course, they can redact certain things using privacy legislation. Coroner's documents, web scraping, media articles, and public government reports that we looked at. So I will probably leave it at that. If people want to learn more about some of these findings, I know we went very quickly through this. We have a blog post. You can check out our website, and we encourage community members and advocates to do their own analyses. And this will continue to be updated on our website. So I will turn it back to Lindsay to close us off.
Thanks everyone for listening to our presentation. And we just wanted to end our presentation, we gave you a bunch of numbers, but it's important to remember that people that are dying in custody are human beings. And this is a beautiful picture of a memorial that was located outside of Elgin Middlesex Detention Center. And it's just important to note that this memorial was eventually ordered to be removed and that the crosses were causing the institution trauma. This was not on any sort of prison property. This was on a safe space. And so just wanted to highlight the importance of being able to memorialize and to remember the loved ones and the people that have been dying in custody. And it would be great if we could challenge or just see if we could have more memorials being launched across at every institution for people that have died inside.
Thank
And
you
so
so much, Lindsay and Jeff.
right now, Alex.
Thanks so much, Lindsay and Jeff. And I noticed there's been quite a number of questions about specifics of the data. All of our data is searchable and public. And so you can do your own searches and specify. So people who are looking for the number of withdrawal deaths or number of Indigenous people who've died, you're able to search that on our website. We also have 3 blog posts that outline all of the findings that were just presented by Lindsay and Jeff on our website. So you can go check out a summary of our findings from that. So, and this will be posted on YouTube afterwards. I wanted now to hand it over to Sandy Pitzel, and thank you first for being here. Much respect and gratitude to you, and also my condolences for the loss of your son, Jordan Norfield, who died in the year 2020 in police custody in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. I wondered if you could share with everybody how you want your son to be remembered, how you first found out about our project, and what you'd like to see change in the system that led to your son's death.
Well, the toughest one is just like people had mentioned at the beginning, we're talking about death. And I know as a loving mom, this is the first time actually that I'm speaking publicly. And, you know, when the other speaker before me was talking, you know, he mentioned like a lot of the newspaper articles. There were newspaper articles when there was an inquest into my son's death. And it was October 30th to November 2nd, 2023. So it just closed recently. And a lot of the information, just like the previous speaker said as well, was new information to me. You know, what the coroner told me was a lot different than what was presented. And I found out a couple months before how different that was. I think remembering my son is the tough one. I know the other moms would probably agree because love stays, you know, like I love all my children. I have 3 other children that are adults and I love them all equally. And my son Jordan was my first son. He looked like me. He never wanted to see anybody suffer or be hurt. Everybody was his buddy. He'd say, "Hey, mom, you know, can you buy my buddy, you know, a meal too if I was visiting with him or whatever." And I'd say, "Oh, like when did you meet your buddy?" Like afterwards, and he'd say, "Oh, just today," you know. So he was really friendly. Every time, no matter what was going on, that we were together, we would have a laugh every single time. And so that's a little bit of insight into my son. I'm First Nations for those people who are joining us. I'm from English River, Dene Nation in Northern Saskatchewan, Treaty 10. My son was Métis. And I found out about injustice and was really impressed with it. I talked with Dr. Alexander McClelland because I was searching my son's name. When you cannot talk about your child's death, he was 30 years old when he died. He was overnight in a police cell and he was laying for the last 3 hours before he was transported to hospital, face down on the cement floor, and was convulsing for over 3 hours. And so I didn't actually find out he was there until later on. I did hear from the hospital the second day he was there. From police custody on the 2nd to the hospital, he was transported December 2nd, and he died 3 days later on December the 5th. So I was just searching my son's name because there's all these articles like the previous speaker said, where it's like, oh, he died in, cells at the police, and it has somewhat of a negative connotation. There's a stigma about the word prisoner, so here he is. And, I was just searching, and the positive thing I found was injustice. My son's name was listed. It's like a memorial site, really, to me. It's like a positive listing of all the people who have died in custody. And so my son's name was there, and I contacted Dr. McClelland when I saw he was with Carleton University, and I wanted to add his race was unknown, and I wanted to know that, the project to know that he was Métis. It was important to me to give them more information. And I'm going to stay involved with them because of the initiatives they're doing. And so moving forward, the third question I had was to say, what would I like to see changed? There's many things, but a few things would be, one, I think the automatic default when police are involved with, being involved with people in the community, is that the default, instead of taking them overnight to a jail cell, is if they are in medical distress, or some of our people are intoxicated that I read, that the default is to take it where they get that better care. Because I hear in general from public comments, I'm a social worker, so I hear, oh, police aren't doctors, they're not nurses. Then I think, just like similar to being in a school setting with our young people, that if somebody is having a convulsion, or there's some sort of unknown medical condition, that they should be immediately transported to the hospital. I think that should be the default. And, in everything, there's an exception, if there's like real, violence or whatever, of course, but maybe that can be looked at. But I think default, that would be important. I think information to families, it is very limited. Just so much is similar to what has been said already about access to information. As a family member, we really struggle. And yeah, they ask us to, pay thousands of dollars for information that we'd like to know in the process. So, I struggled for 3 years before the inquest for my son. And, I didn't have, like I say, a lot of information until, a couple months before the inquest. Yeah, I love this project because it's research-based. All the people, Lindsay involved, supporting the families. And so I don't know, I think that's why I'm staying involved, is that, they bring in numbers because that's what public wants. They want to know, like, what's the real facts. And so you get the real facts here, it's building. And yeah, I just wanted to be involved to bring the personal perspective. My son is missed by many family members, so.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Sandy, and I'm very grateful for being able to work with you and for you sharing your experience. For people who have questions, we'll be taking questions at the very end, so feel free to post them in the question box. I'll hand it over to Jeff and Loreen now.
All right, so yeah, Loreen St. Amour is in the room here with me. So first, Loreen, I want to thank you for taking the time to be part of this difficult conversation today about deaths in custody across Canada. So Loreen and I have known each other for a number of years, I guess since the inquest into the death of her son, Justin St. Amour. So I have so much respect for your advocacy, fighting for justice for Justin and for many others. So thank you for being in conversation today. So I know Justin died at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center in December of 2016. The inquest was in 2019. He died by suicide, but very much because of a lack of care inside prisons, within the community, and the guards failing in their duty of care. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what you think you know, needs to happen to prevent deaths of people that suffer from mental health challenges?
Well, personally, I feel the first thing to do is to get some hospitals that are for the mentally ill to go to rather than jail. Because in jail, they have no support whatsoever. So it would be better that they can get this help from the community
Mhm.
instead of going to jail where they get no help. But I would think that the first step would be to give them mental health supports in the community as opposed to jail.
Yeah, totally. So, what do you think are some concrete steps that we might be able to take as advocates, or let's say people in decision-making authority, could do to address mental health and obviously its connections to suicide as well?
Well, I think that mental health should be provided by the ministry and not by the prisons.
So yeah, so it should be like the
In the
Ministry of
commu-
Health.
Yes, the
Yeah.
Ministry of Health should take care of mental health issues. And
Yeah.
I would wager a bet that about, I would say 85% are mentally ill in jail. Anybody with a substance abuse problem has a mental health problem. My son was schizophrenic. And he had a mental health problem that they cannot help him with. The guards have a half a day training in mental health. So they don't have enough training in mental health to help the individual who's being incarcerated.
Mhm. And like, what do you think we could, like, how can we support families and people? I know earlier you were mentioning like how we could support people with mental health issues in the community instead of waiting until people get criminalized and into the system. So is there anything we could do as tracking injustice, as advocates, as researchers, journalists? Is there things that we can do?
Well, for me, what you have done for me is to help me navigate the complex systems and providing emotional support to the individual and the family. Because with mental health, if the family doesn't change, nothing changes. It has to be with the family to help that specific individual.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like over the years, like advocating, to prevent deaths in custody, you've been speaking out and you keep fighting and you want to see change, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Is there anything else you want to share before we go about, anything that you think that we should
Well,
know?
their response time when a crisis like this happens, it took them between 15 to 20 minutes to get to my son. By that time, he was already dead. They had him alive because he was on life supports. So that's why they had him on. That's
Like the
why
response time was too long.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it needs to be improved.
Hang on.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Loreen, for sharing with us. And Loreen will be able to take questions towards the end, but I will now turn it over to Lindsay Jennings to speak with Martha.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Loreen, so much for sharing. I'm so grateful to be able to speak with Martha today. And Martha, thank you for being here. I do have just a few questions for you. But I also just want to, you have never given up on speaking and fighting for justice for your loved ones. And so would you like to share with us what brings you to tracking injustice today?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Martha Martin. I'm coming to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Wolastoqey people. I'm very grateful to be here today, and I'm here on behalf of my son and my daughter. So my My daughter was Chantal Moore, whose life was taken on June 4th of 2020. And 5 months later, my son would die in police custody. I was told I was told that my son had committed suicide, and the first coroner that was assigned to my son's case had left, and I wasn't even aware of it, so his file had been incompleted. The second coroner had, because I had had a meeting with the ministers in PEI, and they'd reached out, and when I was in BC, I basically had to beg for him to come and meet me, and it was really tough because I hadn't had any, and I still don't have any closure on my son's case. It's 3.5 years since I lost my son, and a little over 4 for my daughter. I'm here today, and in hopes that we can work towards change, because when I'm hearing these numbers, that really, I can't imagine how many people, how many mothers, parents, 400 and something on suicide. That's really alarming. And I was told that my son had asphyxiated himself with his underwear. When we had met with the coroner, we were sitting there, and what was mentioned, because it had only been a couple months after my daughter, and we were talking about the undergarments, and we had realized that we had received his undergarments with his body when he was brought to Port Alberni, BC, when we were picking him up, and his undergarments were intact. And when we had asked about the clothing that he had had on at the time of death, now was like, they don't know where they are.
Martha, what kind of supports do the families need throughout? Like when you're talking about your having to go through all this, and just like with the investigations and not knowing, what kind of supports is missing for the families?
There's a lot of, so one, I think transparency is one of the things that's missing. And somebody had mentioned, when their death comes, they were in jail, they're put as, that label is put on them, and it doesn't mention who they are, who they were, and I think a lot of support systems, a lot of transparency, and the mental health again. I think, when I had received my son's belongings, he had a big thing of different pills that it was on, and I'd looked them up, and some of the prescriptions, and he had told me when we had talked that a lot of them had been on the same prescriptions, and that so it's like maybe a deeper depth, and should doctors be prescribing, what is it, sorry, my mind is just
It's okay. Just and like prescription medication, just over
well,
prescribing.
one of them was when I read, one of the prescriptions was for schizophrenia, and he had mentioned that that there was quite a few of them that had had the same prescription in these systems, and we need to start looking deeper into into the mental health and the state, of their mental well-being. I think that should start, when we're at a courthouse and they're deciding, like, is there any red flags that this person is mentally unstable? Um,
No,
and I
that's
talk about one of the things that I talk about is restorative justice a lot. And the restorative justice kind of gives a bigger picture of what that person has been through in their life, not just, putting them in front of a judge. Did you do the crime? Yes. Well, now you do the time. And I talk about restorative justice with whoever I can because, it gives a person another chance as well. And I think, having that option, a police officer has that option when arresting somebody, whether it goes to restorative justice or it goes to court. You know, I think that needs to be something that needs to be more pushed more forward is restorative justice, because I think when we think of how many people have been in justice because of the color of their skin, we see so much systemic racism, not only within New Brunswick. I think about the people who've died in custody because it could have been prevented, mental health or just health in general.
No, thank you, Martha. Everything you said, we definitely need to be addressing mental health inside um, way more and upon arrest. And so I just deeply thank you for being here today.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna now send it over again if people have questions.
I just
Oh
have
yeah,
one more
go ahead.
comment.
Sorry, Martha. Go
So
ahead.
one more quick comment. So, after the passing of my daughter, so this is one of the good plus sides. I was able to work with, and I never ever thought I would be in that position where I'd be comfortable enough to do it. But I had met with the chief of police, Dal Manick in Victoria, BC, and he came, and this was mind you, this is in the beginning of COVID. And, I wanted to do a gathering in BC, but I didn't want to step on any toes and I didn't want anybody at my gathering getting in trouble. So I had reached out to the Victoria Police, and the chief of police ended up calling me back, and he came and he heard my daughter's story about Chantal Moore, and it inspired him to want to do better in his police station. So he had used my daughter's story, her name, her story, and I gave him that permission because what he was doing was working towards getting 2 psychiatric nurses within his policing department. So what he did was he went through Vancouver Island Health Authority, and I'm saying it because I'd like to see this happen throughout more policing units, where we're having psychiatric nurses, people who are properly trained to assess somebody in that moment, where you're saying there was 1 day training, I think somebody had mentioned, so they provided half the funding for the psychiatric nurses, and they are now assisted with a police officer in civilian clothing, and they go in an unmarked vehicle. So this is something to think about, when we think about across our country, because mental health, as we know, is an ongoing problem within Canada, and it's not going to go away. And instead of sending a police officer alone who's untrained, maybe this is you know, possibly I'm really hoping that it goes further.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's hope it does. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you so much, Martha and Loreen and Sandy. We've got a number of comments just sending you all power and respect and deep condolences from the participants in the webinar. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask our next speakers to be brief, but also want to make sure that so we have time for questions, because we actually have a surprising number of questions here. One of them that I just thought people could focus on for the next round is just what has stood out for people as surprising in these findings, and what do you want to see be done? But I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Chambers, who's the Executive Director of the Empowerment Council, and was wondering if you could talk to us about health services and suicides and mental health supports, because of the findings in relation to suicide are quite shocking.
Thanks, Alex. So until tracking of justice, no one's counted the people dying in custody in Canada every year. And it's astounding that the government of Canada and every province cares so little for the lives of people in custody that they don't even keep a central record of who's died on their watch. So as Canadians, we reject the death penalty, yet people in custody have more than half the lifespan of people, little more than half the lifespan of people on the outside, half. If supports were available to them in the community, many wouldn't be in the justice system at all. Hundreds of people have died before even coming to trial or being granted bail. And many people end up in the criminal justice system because they've never been able to access the supports that they need in the community. Sadly, some family members become so desperate to get mental health care for their relatives, some have laid false charges in the hope they'll get their loved ones into the mental health system, often with disastrous consequences. When people enter the system and are having acute difficulties coping with reality, for example, they can end up in segregation or seclusion. It's the same, just depends on whether you're considered an inmate or an inpatient. This isolation can increase or cause psychosis, self-harm, violence, and suicidality. Legislation governing corrections considers segregation to effectively ended by requiring someone in a locked cell to have at least 2 hours a day of meaningful social contact. However, meaningful social contact in jail has been defined as someone standing in a room by themselves holding a ball, being allowed to read a book. It's not meaningful, it's not human contact, it's not an interaction. In the forensic mental health system, there's no law requiring even that limitation to seclusion. People are still feeling the effects of COVID isolation in the community, which included visiting at a distance, limitless telephone and Zoom calls. What kind of effect do you think this degree of isolation might have on a person in custody? So with 21% of the deaths in the database being suicides, it's apparent many people would rather die than remain in their current conditions. We can't look at natural deaths as inevitable either, because many people have died from not receiving the necessary medical care while imprisoned. These are preventable deaths, but a political will for humane conditions and alternatives to detention is required. There needs to be a recognition that many people in custody are trauma survivors and need supports that will help them with this trauma. Simply medicating people is not care. We provide opportunities for people to get their needs met in the community. Many would not be in the criminal justice system at all. And if community supports were available to people in custody, those that are in it could emerge better off and not worse. Right now, we're all paying for a system that leaves people worse off, in which many don't even survive. And this harm is not befalling people equally. Indigenous peoples continue to pay the highest price for the harm Canada has done to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. In the long run, a system that creates more hurt and neglect hurts all of us. We need to stop killing people in custody now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for those powerful words. Next, I want to ask Nick Boyce, Senior Drug Policy Analyst at the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, to reflect on the findings of the number of overdoses in the data.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm Nick Boyce for the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. We work with dozens of organizations across Canada advocating for evidence-informed drug policy grounded in public health, human rights, and social justice. As a society, as a country, as institutions, we can make better policies when we have better evidence. Today's data is evidence that we do not have good policies in carceral settings. Setting aside questions of why we even incarcerate people or who gets incarcerated, it is clear people who use drugs while in custody, and current policies and lack of effective programs are killing them. For many years, Canada has been experiencing an overdose and unregulated drug crisis. On average, 22 people are killed each day. The crisis extends to people who use drugs in prison. As this data show, a significant number of deaths in custody are related to drug overdose and toxic poisoning. Known life-preserving harm reduction interventions have been called for years, such as access to sterile drug-using equipment, supervised consumption spaces, timely access to withdrawal management, and voluntary evidence-based treatment. Naloxone is a medication that can reverse an opioid drug overdose. We know of cases where it was not available in prisons, or worse, it was available and prison staff refused to use it. This is totally unacceptable. While some limited focus has been directed towards implementing harm reduction measures in federal institutions, current approaches remain wholly inadequate. As they currently exist, there are significant problems which severely limit their accessibility and efficacy. They may not comply with Sections 7 and 15 of the Charter, and they are failing to respect both domestic and international standards of prison healthcare and basic human rights. Harm reduction measures are simply non-existent in many provincial and territorial institutions. The prohibition and criminalization of drug use is driving the crisis both inside and outside of carceral settings. We waste significant resources on futile efforts to stop the supply of drugs, resources that could be directed to more holistic prevention, harm reduction, and treatment initiatives, measures that would effectively reduce overall drug consumption, support people who use drugs, and build safer communities and a healthier society. The evidence is clear. We must do better. We need a paradigm shift in our approach to drug use, and there must be transparency and accountability within carceral settings. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Nick Boyce. I will now hand it over to Catherine Latimer, the Executive Director of the John Howard Society, to reflect on the findings and the issue of accountability for a number of deaths in custody.
Thanks, Alex, and congratulations to you and your team for putting together this important data set. I think it will make a big difference. And it's very important because right now, as has been revealed from many of your participants here, we don't really have enough information about why people are dying in custody. I think the challenges around suicide and overdose deaths have been touched on by both Nick and Jennifer, but there are other issues, other questions that should be raised as well. I think we need to look deeper into the causes of deaths that are attributed to natural causes. Was the medical intervention timely and adequate? Many families who have had loved ones who've died of cancer or other long-term diseases have argued quite strenuously that the diagnosis of that illness came far too late, in many cases months or years after the person was complaining about the symptoms. As others have pointed out, John Howard believes that the healthcare provided to federal prisoners is substandard. When your jailer is your healthcare provider, issues of security and cost will trump prisoners' needs. Corrections should get out of the healthcare business. It doesn't belong in that business. Also, internal investigations into the deaths of prisoners are not adequate. If the prisoner died as a result of either the use of force by correctional staff or another prisoner, or there are issues around negligence, there are liability issues which could skew the could skew the openness and objectivity of the correctional investigations. Both the families of Soliman Fakiri and Matthew Hines were doggedly persistent and worked with investigative journalists to uncover the truth about the deaths of their prisoners. And many families have yet to experience any closure and are still asking questions about why their loved ones perished. We need to have much better accountability and openness around the deaths of people in custody. Now, coroner's inquests are often good at uncovering how a person died and making recommendations to prevent those deaths. But a problem is that those coroner's inquests often happen years after the individual died, leaving families and the public with big questions and big concerns about what had transpired. And a particular issue around deaths in federal custody is that these provincially constituted bodies are not, their findings and their processes are not binding on the Correctional Service of Canada. I think the recent Terry Baker inquest is illustrative of this. As many of you know, she died in the same cell some 7 or 9 years after Ashley Smith died in that cell by the same self-induced act of self-harm. And one of the major recommendations coming out of the Baker inquest that happened years later was that they should finally get around to implementing the recommendations that had been made in the Ashley Smith case. So there's the unwillingness to actually take steps to prevent deaths, I think, is quite telling. And I think it really indicates a failure of the coroner's inquest process in terms of its effectiveness in dealing with federal prisoners. So I think we need another mechanism of independent, medically informed investigations into the deaths of prisoners to ensure accountability and to ensure that recommended preventative measures are in fact implemented. So I think there are big challenges ahead, and I think this database will be really helpful for us to press down on some of the key issues that need to be addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So now I just welcome, thank you to all of our speakers and for all of your words and thoughts and suggestions, and very grateful that you were all able to be here with us today. I just welcome anyone who's an attendee to ask questions in the chat or in the question function. I'll get to a few of them here. One of them was, and I can ask this question to Lindsay and Jeff, is there a breakdown of deaths in custody by institution? Such information might provide insight into which human caging sites are the most deadly. Ideally, a mortality rate by institution could be established, but what would require getting precise annual average incarceration rates at the institutional level, which might yield which, given the state of the access to information request, this would be a ton of work and may not yield the sought after results. But generally, they want to know, do we have a breakdown of deaths in custody by institution? Thank you, Justin Pichet, for the question.
Yeah, really quickly, we do have a breakdown, and it will be shared on our blog post that will give you some of the top institutions. And we can, in the future too, we're going to be releasing more stuff. It's just that the institution breakdown is huge. And so we just want to, we wanted to give a snapshot today, but if you go to our blog post, or blog posts, I should say, on our website, then you can see the breakdown of the institutions.
So we list the top 5 federal institutions, provincial institutions, and police forces in terms of the most deadly. The next question we have is, do we have a breakdown of Indigenous deaths into First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on the website? Maybe.
So when it comes to racial data, it's a bit more complicated. So obviously the Indigenous label goes, the identity goes with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, but we have not broken it down past that because in the information that we're provided, it often doesn't. Sometimes it does, but it's just so far and few between that it's very difficult to know what people's actual identities are unless it's written down in official documents.
And this is for all of the speakers, anyone who would like to jump in. What would people's biggest takeaway from these numbers be, and what is the most surprising thing to you out of the findings? Anyone who would like to go? I think people identified that already, but anyone who wants to go again? Catherine?
Yeah, I would say that the increase in the number of deaths, I mean, your data kind of, you're still collecting information in those later years, and it seems to have had a pretty steady increase in deaths around 20 to 21, and then it kind of levels off. But I think that's because the data has not been fully implemented in those years. I mean, that's very troubling for organizations who are advocating for just, effective, and humane corrections. And so that, to me, that's a very telling issue, and it indicates that this should be given some policy priority across the board.
Thank you, Catherine. One other question is, how do you use the data when you have conflicting information about deaths? Coroner's reports versus police reports versus family information and quotes from people. Maybe Lindsay and Jeff.
Yeah, this was kind of a little bit of a big topic of conversation because using the word unknown didn't sit right with me personally, knowing that if I had been supporting families or I knew what happened and then you don't have the proper information, being able to use the word unknown. But I think that the more comfortable we got with using the term unknown, it just painted a whole other picture of the lack of information that we're getting and the lack of access about the details and about things that happen. And so I think it's a balance between trying to figuring out what you are hearing. I mean, even families here get calls from people that are incarcerated telling them about how their loved one dies. And so then when you hear that and you get that information, and then you read a coroner's inquest and they're conflicting again, how do we break that down? Sometimes we just have to use unknown because we don't know what to put. But it also, I guess it maybe just drives us to find out more information as well, to dig up more information. It's just hard to, me personally, I would believe the person calling from the institution on how the person died compared to some government documents about what took place. Not sure if that answered your question, but
I'll also highlight for everybody that we have a function on our website where people can submit errors in the data if they want to revise information, and we vet that if there's someone who is a family member or has insight, so people can correct details. We also are aware and very cautious around the materials that we use, because we know often coroner's documents, coroner reports, inquest documents are used to let institutions off the hook in terms of accountability. And so while we do collect that information and present it publicly, we hope that people can interrogate that. So one of the ways that can happen, for example, is we know that there's a minimum of 15 deaths in our database that have been deemed natural by coroners that involved various different forms of tactical interventions, and including physical handling, restraints, chemical inflammatory weapons such as a spray foam or a pepper spray. And so hopefully people can look into those deaths and question as to why they've been deemed natural, because that's not a natural way to die.
Can I make an additional comment, Alex?
Yes, of course, please.
One is on what you just said, that I believe in future we're going to be looking into that the whole concept of excited delirium and what gets passed off as natural deaths in that regard. And I also wanted to make the point that when we're looking at alternatives to custody, it's important that we don't think streamlining people into custody in the mental health system is the best solution. People die in the mental health system as well. There's racist application of use of force in the mental health system. People they can spend months in seclusion in the mental health system as well. So ideally, I mean, in Toronto, we've developed alternatives to police that are community-based, non-coercive, rights-respecting crisis services. And I hope that concept will really spread in Canada.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We have one remaining question, unless there's any others that people have. Does the definition of custody follow the same in custody definition the coroner identifies with? Maybe Lindsay or Jeff, you could address that question.
No, so it doesn't align exactly with the coroner, because we have a broader definition, and that we also include people that would be under the Mental Health Act, or some of them call it like the intoxicant acts. So this is where people are, they might be held in a police station for a bit and then transferred into the mental health system. And we know, looking at those cases as well, they're in custody in a mental health facility against their will, right? So they're still, they're still being held and potentially harmed, and some of them dying, right? So this is where we've made it a bit broader, and also including like transportation vehicles, because sometimes it might be a handoff from one institution to the next, right? So it might be corrections handing off to mental health facility, or police handing off to another agency, and deaths can happen in transit very often, even in the transportation vehicles, like basically being held in a little cage. Nobody should be in a cage.
Thanks, Jeff. We have one other question, or two other questions. One is in the section in memory on the Deaths in Custody website, which is what we launched last year on Prisoners' Justice Day, the memorial. There's a lot of unknown deaths with a date. What does that mean? What does that tell us? Thank you, Catherine Chesney, for the question. Lindsay or Jeff, maybe you could address that.
Yeah, so just the unknowns is just that we may not have their names. Their names were not released. So I guess maybe an example of that would be Correction Service Canada releases news releases of when people die in custody. And so what we saw during COVID is that the news releases changed. So if there was COVID that was linked to the possible death, they were not releasing names or ages. And so we just didn't know. And so we have a bunch of people that have died in custody that we don't even know their names. And I think that is very sad, and that every person deserves not to have to die in vain and deserves a little bit of justice, and families to be able to recognize somebody as the person and not their charges. So unknown is just that we don't know the information. Sorry, went on a little tangent there.
I just want to add briefly to that too, is that like I think that governments try to use privacy legislation to basically get out of being held accountable. These are human lives. The names should be released. They use privacy acts to hold this information so that they can evade accountability and be held liable. So I think that yes, sometimes, obviously people don't want the names released, but I think we need them because it brings this to life. It's not just numbers, right? It's people dying in custody that need to be prevented. And that's why we're all wearing the t-shirts, no more deaths in custody. So
it's also important, one thing that we do have on our website is a form that, if people don't want their loved one on there, they can go and report and send us a message that they would like the information taken off. And so we're giving the options for folks. And we also created just that pathway. So some people want to be able to keep it to themselves, and maybe they don't want their loved one's name. And some of those could be, they don't want the names, but they want the holding star on our memorial page.
We have one final question. Do you publish the names of cops who killed people in custody?
I think that, no, we don't publish the names. Sometimes we don't even know those names, right? And I think that's the important piece. We saw that with the Ijaz Chaudhry case just recently, that police didn't want to reveal the names of the cops that killed Ijaz. And so there's not many officers that get charged. That's a whole other process that comes after the coroner's inquest, is asking families to get money, to go through financial burden, to hire lawyers in order to find somebody to lay charges on an officer. And so, Solomon Fakiri had called for charges to be laid and nothing was done, called for advocacy and apology from Doug Ford, and nothing happened after the 6 months. And so I think it's something that we can use this information, and people, other groups and other organizations can take this information and maybe figure out ways to put more accountability on the officers who have killed people or contributed to the death of someone inside.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm conscious of the time and really grateful for all of the questions. If anyone wants to get in touch, you can reach us through my email, which is alexander.mcclelland@carleton.ca. And I'm easily found on the Carleton website, and we can address any of your questions, and I can connect you to any of the speakers if you have any follow-up questions for them. I'm very grateful for people today, for all of your words, and for people joining. Just a reminder to take care of yourself today, and take a time to breathe and go outside if it's not raining like it is in Ottawa. And also just wanted to thank all of the family members today, thank all of the wonderful experts and advocates who were here, who joined us, and thank all of our amazing tracking and justice team who've spent the past 2 years digging through coroners' reports and documents to put this website together. Also, thank you to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council who have funded this research. So be well and take care, and be in touch if you have any other questions. Thanks so much. And for all of the presenters, Lindsay's going to send you a link in a minute.